everyone. Lacey here, your dietitian here at Ascension. I hope you've enjoyed the session so far. If this is your first one, know that we try to record these once a week and share some tips with you guys about mind-body wellness. Specifically, we're focusing in on good nutrition and how what we eat can affect our physical body and also how we feel, how we interact with each other, and how we can recover mind, body, and spirit. So anyway, today's session is titled Going with the Flow. And this is one of the topics that I feel like can be most transformative for any person that's just looking to improve their health physically, mentally, across the board. And that is balancing our blood sugar. So when we think blood sugar, we often just think about diabetes, whether that's type 1 diabetes that's developed in childhood, or type 2 diabetes that's more common in older folks. Balancing blood sugar is something that we can all benefit from, whether we have a diagnosis or we do not. It's something that we can, once we are more aware, can pay attention to throughout the day and observe an almost immediate difference in how we're feeling, and then how that translates into how we act, think, engage, etc. So I'm really excited to share this with you guys. If anyone has questions, suggestions, thoughts, you want to talk one-on-one, that's what I'm here for. These topics are just to kind of get the ball rolling and to let you know about some of the more important things that we can be doing. But if anyone wants to chat one-on-one about your individual needs or individual issues that you might be having, feel free to speak with the team there about connecting with me for a one-on-one session. So let's get started. So first, I just want to kind of poll the audience here, and you can talk amongst yourselves here. When we say low blood sugar, what are some of the symptoms? What comes to mind as far as symptoms that you've observed either in yourself or in someone that you know when it comes to low blood sugar? What's something that a symptom that you've seen or experienced yourself? I'll give you just a moment. Think about that. Maybe shout some out. Jot some down in your notebook. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share. So low blood sugar, again, is not reserved just for those folks who have a diagnosis of diabetes. All of us can experience low blood sugar at some point during our day, week, month, year. And it's caused by a combination of adrenaline, so that hormone that gets released when we're experiencing stress, that signaling our body it's time to fight or freeze or flee, get out of a situation, and a hungry brain. And so some things that are noteworthy here that folks experience can be the feelings of anxiety. So shaking, sweating, maybe heart racing or pounding, beating out of your chest, irritability, anger. We can sometimes call those two hangry, tears, brain fog, or just not thinking really clearly, can't put our words together, can't remember what it was we were doing, and also just signs of being really tired, so fatigue or insomnia. A lot of folks experience low blood sugar in the middle of the night and just have these, random bouts of just waking up suddenly. And that's oftentimes triggered by the fact that our blood sugar is dropping at night based on, what was going on, what we ate or didn't eat before going to bed. So these are all signs of our blood sugar dropping lower than what our body would like it to be. So in this case, low blood sugar can be translated to low dopamine in the brain. And most of us probably know about dopamine. It's that feel-good hormone. It's what makes us have those feelings of excitement and euphoria and that get up and go. And when our blood sugar drops, it usually means that dopamine is in low supply. So some early research shows that a low or dropping blood sugar level can lead to cravings. That's because there's low dopamine, and our body then starts looking for dopamine in whatever way that it can create it. Ultimately, this could lead to relapse in both process and chemical addictions of any severity. So that's why this is relevant to us in this conversation. It doesn't matter what our distraction of choice might be. Whatever the body is craving to get that dopamine surge, we can look for it in a lot of different places, but oftentimes it can be triggered by something as benign as our blood sugar dropping too low because we haven't eaten in a while, or maybe we ate something that caused our blood sugar to spike and then drop even lower. We also know from some research that women with a history of substance use disorder are more likely to relapse during the last phase of the monthly menstrual cycle. So just before we see the period come back. So that PMS, we often call it, when we're feeling right before we menstruate, that premenstrual syndrome. It's because our dopamine levels, serotonin levels, and blood sugar levels all become very dysregulated, causing those symptoms of low blood sugar, low dopamine, that create a lot of turmoil in our brain and our mind. So I think it's helpful just to have a really basic understanding of how blood sugar metabolism works. And once we have this kind of baseline understanding, then it becomes more strategic on our part to help support it, and rather than to work against it, causing some of these problems that we know can occur. So blood sugar level in our body, it's a metabolic process. It happens within our physiology in our body, and it's tightly controlled. So our body likes to have a really regular blood sugar. It thrives on having a consistent supply of sugar going to all parts of the body. Not too much, not too little, but just a steady, nice little drip. It's just like the fuel in your car. If you've got too much fuel, your gas tank overflows or not enough, your car is not going to run. So our body is very similar. It likes to have a steady, even flow. So when we eat food, and these are primarily where blood sugar is made, it comes from carbohydrates. So you can think for a second, maybe shout out, what are some of those carbohydrate foods? So breads, pastas, cereals, most all of our junk foods, sugary candy, snacks, sodas, Gatorades, energy bars, granola bars. Those are all carbohydrate foods. And these foods are broken down into what our body knows as glucose. We just call it sugar. And this glucose or sugar, it passes into the bloodstream. So we eat it, it goes down into our stomach, it gets churned up, and from our stomach, it goes into our intestines and starts to absorb into our bloodstream. This leads to a rise in a blood sugar level. So we can measure our blood, we draw out some blood and see that right after we eat, the sugar concentration in our blood goes up. And the length of time it takes for any given food to raise our blood sugar is called the glycemic index. So we'll look at a little chart in a second to see which types of foods raise our blood sugar the fastest. And when this glucose or blood sugar is in our bloodstream, this sends a message to our pancreas. It's a little organ that's just outside, attached to our liver, to release small amounts of insulin. And this insulin, you may know someone who has to inject themselves with insulin or wears an insulin drip, or gives himself an insulin out of a syringe. This insulin is like a key, and it opens the door into our muscles, into our other organs, into our brain, and allows the sugar that's in our blood, that glucose, to go in and provide the fuel for our body to get all of the work done that it needs to do to allow us to function. So insulin is really important in this blood sugar metabolism That's where we get those diagnoses of diabetes. It's when the insulin, something's going awry with the insulin production and or our body's sensitivity to insulin. So insulin is the key, and glucose is what goes in the door. Blood sugar is what goes in the door that the insulin opens. So in someone who doesn't have diabetes, it's pretty straightforward. The cells open up of our muscles and brain and different organs. The blood sugar goes in, and it either uses it pretty quickly or it can store it for future needs. So it can be stored in the cells as glycogen, or it can be stored like in our attic as fat. So it gets kind of converted and stored into our fat cells, but that's a different topic for a different day. So the circulating blood sugar levels then in our bloodstream goes down. So if we were to measure, again, we draw out some blood, maybe a couple hours later after we had eaten, we'll see that these blood sugar levels in our blood starts to go back down. So it gets lower. So right after we ate, the sugar in the blood gets higher. A couple hours after we eat, the sugar in our blood generally drifts down. When the blood sugar levels drip close to baseline, or just that steady state where our body is just kind of not doing a whole lot with it, the brain says, hey, it's time to eat again. Our blood levels, your sugar levels in the blood are dropping kind of low. We don't want them to get too low because, the brain might need them, or you might need to take off running and the muscles might need them. Or the heart, needs to keep beating, so it might need them. And so our brain sends a message to, or our pancreas sends a message back up to our brain and says, hey, time to eat again. Let's go get some food. So people find a source of food and raise those blood sugar levels back up. And this whole cycle should take somewhere around 4 hours. And throughout that period, the blood sugar levels should rise and fall in a nice steady wave throughout the day. So what can kind of throw a wrench in the cog is then what foods we're eating and how often. So we mentioned the term glycemic index earlier, and that's just a fancy way to say these foods are higher in the glycemic index, or they turn to sugar in our blood much more quickly, versus these foods are lower on the glycemic index and they turn to sugar much more slowly in the body. So pure sugar is the highest rank on the glycemic index, and it's 100. A cup of cornflakes is around 84, and apples are toward the lower end at 35. The way I think about this intuitively is the foods that are more easy to chew or almost dissolve just right in your mouth on your tongue are going to be higher in how quickly they turn to sugar and get into the bloodstream, versus the foods that are kind of harder to chew or need to be cooked quite a bit before we eat them, or have a combination of other things, like they're not pure sugar, but they, in this case, dairy I'm pointing at here, has some fat and protein in it as well. So it gets absorbed into the bloodstream much more slowly. And this process, when foods are lower on the glycemic index, is less demanding on the pancreas and the body as a whole. So when we choose more of foods or add foods to our meal that are lower on the glycemic index, then it has an effect on the foods that we're eating at that same meal that might be higher. So maybe we have a sandwich and it's on white bread, which is high on the glycemic index. But if we throw some peanut butter on there or meat of any kind, and we have, a soup with some vegetables and meat in it alongside it, then this white bread is going to turn into sugar and hit our bloodstream a lot more slowly than if we were to only have the toast or the bread by itself, or just eat the piece of watermelon and nothing else. So this is where that idea of a balanced diet comes from, why it's important to have more than just one thing at a meal or at a time. That's why it's a good idea to not just drink a sugary beverage by itself, but to have it either not at all and just have water, or to have it with a meal so that that sugar hits our bloodstream a lot more slowly not causing that sharp rise in blood sugar, which is followed by a really sharp fall in blood sugar, which translates into that low dopamine or low other neurotransmitters that can then lead to cravings and ultimately sometimes relapse. So this is where we're getting to and why it's so important to think about balancing things out. So proteins, fiber, and fats generally slow down our digestion. So they're harder to chew, they're harder for our stomach to churn up, and they trickle into our bloodstream a lot slower. Whereas refined sugars and starches like sugar, flour, or things made with sugar and flour, cornstarch, soda pops, etc., typically rank a lot higher because they raise blood sugar levels much more quickly. Also of note that tobacco and other nicotine sources, as well as caffeine from coffee, but also caffeinated drinks like Red Bulls and other things of that nature in addition to stimulant drugs, can also increase how quickly blood sugar rises after a meal. So a balanced meal would be a mixture of some protein. We talked about in the previous session in the previous workshop. You can go back and listen to that or maybe catch it in a future session, the importance of always having protein at every meal. So meat, fish, eggs, dairy, beans, nuts, seeds, etc. Also some fiber. So when we have fruits and vegetables, that's where we get some fiber that slows down the digestions, the foods digesting in our system. And then whole grain. So why would someone want to have a whole grain pasta or whole grain bread as opposed to white? Well, we know it's because it doesn't necessarily taste better, but it's because it does have some of that fiber, which can slow down how quickly the food gets into our system, and that ultimately the carbohydrates into our bloodstream. There's a lot of other benefits as well, but in this particular scenario, that's what we're looking at. And then beans, nuts, seeds, and fats from meat, dairy, nuts, and seeds, as well as our cold pressed oils like olive oil, coconut oil, any of our dressings and butter and things that we'll cook with. All really great ways to balance out our meal and balance out our blood sugar. So when the system goes awry, so far what we've talked about is someone who is, not with a diagnosis of diabetes, doesn't have insulin issues, has a, relatively normal, I'm using air quotes, ability to self-regulate our blood sugar. But there's also this concept of that's called reactive hypoglycemia. And so it's not necessarily something that comes with a diagnosis, but it's something that we can all experience. And it's more common in certain populations than others. So at least 80% of people who have alcohol dependency, or women who are premenstrual, or those who habitually eat large amounts of sugar or refined carbohydrates, can find that they have this dysregulated blood sugar metabolism, or symptoms that we talked about in the very beginning. They experience those symptoms of low blood sugar more often than others. And this is termed reactive hypoglycemia, and it's something that can develop over time. This is something that even can predispose us to later diagnosis of diabetes. So in these cases, the pancreas releases an excessive amount of insulin, leading to a steep drop in blood sugar, which may even fall below the normal baseline. So generally what's happened here is that our body has routinely experienced or is prepared to receive large amounts of carbohydrates because it's used to us eating large amounts. And so in response, it says, oh, we're going to need a lot of insulin to take this down, or to escort that sugar into the bloodstream. And so what happens is over time, the pancreas just kind of wears out, and it doesn't really know how much it's supposed to make. It'll make too much or not enough, and, gets kind of crazy and burned out. And so over time, it can produce so much that our blood sugar can drop too low, or it just can't keep up with the demand. And so our blood sugar can fall really low. And the adrenaline is released from our adrenal glands, which is trying to kind of slow this down by stimulating the release of some stored blood sugar into the bloodstream. The second thing that happens is the drop in blood sugar continues, and now the starving and an unbalanced brain sends this urgent signal back to the body to do whatever it takes to bring the blood sugar levels back up. And what that ultimately leads to when the body's like, hey, I don't care what you need to do, just, get me back to feeling normal again, can cause cravings. And the body is really telling us, hey, you need food, but sometimes that message can get misconstrued, and it leads to a craving for whatever substance is nearby, or we're most prone to going toward. So this is the craving cascade. So this message can be translated into a powerful craving for quick energy sources, but the signal could just as easily lead to a craving for a drug or another addictive behavior of choice, since our brains have previously been conditioned to look for this drug of choice to restore equilibrium. That's our coping mechanism. So a person with alcohol dependency would crave alcohol. Someone who has a dependency on sugar would crave sugar. Someone who is more drawn to cigarettes to cope would crave a cigarette, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the picture here. So it seems really silly, like, why is sugar, why is balancing my blood sugar, eating a balanced diet so important? Well, you can see how it's directly related to making it a whole lot easier to abstain from our distraction of choice. And it's so simple in terms of just making sure that we're feeding ourselves relatively balanced, relatively regularly throughout the day. So this relapse-inducing craving especially occurs if a meal is missed, or if it's just been too long since the last time we've eaten and the brain has been fed. So this slide is a little bit out of control, or out of control is a little bit messed up, but it's talking about self-control and glucose. This is just some of the research that's saying that self-control relies on some sort of a limited energy source, and that if we really want to engage our ability and our physiology, our brain's ability to start to have more and develop more self-control, then we need to make sure that our brains are in a well-fed state in order to function as we'd like them to. So this slide is just pointing to more of the same. So glucose is brain fuel. We talked before about how the fact that the brain produces these signals, or these messengers called neurotransmitters. And in order to make those neurotransmitters, we need to have protein in our diet. We need to be eating protein, enough of it, and pretty regularly, to build those mailmen, or those message carriers. But also those mailmen or message carriers need to have fuel to get to where they're going. And that's where this glucose comes in handy. So how could sugar and low blood sugar exert such a strong negative effect on addiction, recovery, and general health? It's because the brain absolutely requires glucose, or blood sugar, to function. And although the brain's mass is only 2% of our average body weight, it uses 20% of the carbohydrates that we consume. So our brain massively consumes blood sugar, and it needs it. It just needs it in the right amounts, and needs it in a steady stream throughout the day, rather than a bunch all at once, or none for a really long time. So the brain does not have the capacity to metabolize its own source of energy, and it can store very limited amounts of sugar. So it needs us to supply it a steady source of fuel. Some other things just to note here is that a well-functioning prefrontal cortex, this might be something that you're learning about in your recovery journey, is absolutely crucial to sobriety. And so for this prefrontal cortex, this area of the brain, to create willpower, it needs a steady supply of glucose. So this is why we see a lot of people trying so hard, and it seems like no matter, you may have been in this situation, no matter how hard you try or how bad you want this to happen, it just feels like you can't get to where you're going, or you just continue to have these backslides or relapse. And it could be related to the fact that the brain is simply not getting what it needs to do all of these skills that we're learning about in our recovery. So relatively low blood sugar reflects in low glucose supply in the prefrontal cortex, thereby it lowers our willpower ability and the ability to say no. So low or dropping blood sugar results in a surge of adrenaline and other stress hormones. These also impair the effective signaling in that region of the brain. So our executive functioning is impaired. This leads to a lack of use of our recovery skills and our relapse prevention skills, and in response to a relapse trigger. So hypoglycemia, or low blood sugar induced stress response, may also stimulate a conditioned response toward the use of addictive substances and behaviors. So in summary here, what we're saying is that when the brain isn't getting adequate fuel, when it's not getting a steady supply of blood sugar, because of maybe the hypoglycemia that we mentioned, or we just haven't eaten for a really long time, or we just ate a whole bunch of carbs all at once and then didn't eat for, quite a long time afterwards, then the brain doesn't have the fuel that it needs to function. It's like trying to walk into your house and turn the light on, but the electricity bill wasn't paid. So there's no power, right? It's just not going to happen no matter how many times you flip that switch. So something really simple to think about there. So in summary, some 3 takeaway points here that I hope that you'll remember are: 1, never have a naked carbohydrate by itself. And what would a naked carb be? Well, it's just having a bowl of sugary cereal in the morning, or it's just drinking sugary soda for lunch, or it's eating just a big plate of pasta for dinner, and not a lot of anything to help dilute those carbs getting into the bloodstream. So never have a naked carb is 1. Another takeaway point I hope you'll remember is to eat protein every 4 hours. And I mentioned this during the previous talk, or maybe you'll hear it in a couple of weeks. We kind of cycle through these. And our protein foods, you might remember, are meat of any kind, beef, pork, chicken, fish, shellfish, also plant proteins like beans, nuts, and seeds. Protein powders and shakes and bars are okay if you absolutely can't get anything else, but just beware that they don't have a lot of those sugar bombs or carbohydrates along with them. And then the last point here is kind of goes without saying, is try to avoid those sugar bombs as often as we can. Those are mostly our processed foods like sodas, Gatorades, energy drinks, candies of all shapes and sizes, cookies, crackers, things of that nature, and any other junk food that you can imagine, especially on an empty stomach. If we are going to have those things, just try to make it part of a balanced meal so that they're trickling into the bloodstream rather than rushing into the bloodstream, creating all of those downstream responses in our body, the adrenaline release, the low dopamine response that can ultimately trigger and lead to relapse. So if you guys have questions about any of this, feel free to reach out, have the team there, to let the team there know that you'd like to schedule a one-on-one to talk about this and or any other topics that are related to our mind, body wellness, nutrition, fitness, mindfulness, yoga, all of those things I love to share with folks. So it's been great. Again, my name is Lacey. Anyone has questions, feel free to reach out. Take care.